So this is from the Gulag archipelago. One of my informants has told me how executions were carried out at Adak, a camp on the Pechora River. They would take the opposition members with their things out of the camp compound on a prisoner transport at night, and outside the compound stood the small house of the third section. The condemned men were taken into a room one at a time, and there the camp guards sprang on them. Their mouths were stuffed with something soft, and their arms were bound with cords behind their backs. And see, these were political prisoners who opposed the Soviet system. The condemned men, then they were led out into the courtyard where harnessed carts were waiting. The bound prisoners were piled on the carts from 5 to 7 at a time and driven off to the Gorka, the camp cemetery. On arrival, they were tipped into big pits that had already been prepared and buried alive. Not out of brutality. No. It had been ascertained that when dragging and lifting them, it was much easier to cope with living people than with corpses. The work went on for many nights at Adak, and that is how the moral, political unity of our party was achieved. This is from Viktor Frankl, from his experiences in the Nazi concentration camps. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when, at a still nocturnal hour, the 3 shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were swollen and sore with edema. And there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone whom I knew to be brave and dignified cry like a child because he finally had to go to the snowy marching grounds in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly moments, I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. From Solzhenitsyn. In cold lower than 60 degrees below zero, work days were written off. In other words, on such days the records showed that the workers had not gone out to work because 60 below was the cutoff for work. But they chased them out anyways, and whatever they squeezed out of them on those days was added to the other days, thereby raising the percentages. And the servile medical section wrote off those who froze to death on such cold days on some other basis. And the ones who were left, who could no longer walk and were straining every sinew to crawl along on all fours on the way back to camp, the convoy simply shot so that they wouldn't escape before they could come back to get them. This is from William Blake. O Rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, hath found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Solzhenitsyn. Macbeth's self-justifications for his murders were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses. That was because they had no ideology. Ideology. That is what gives evil doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory, which helps to make this act, his act, seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes. That was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills by invoking Christianity, the conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland, the colonizers by civilization, the Nazis by race, and the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. Fire. Fire. The branches crackle, and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I am alone at the bonfire, and I can bring it still some more carpenter shavings. The compound here is a privileged one, so privileged that it is almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is the Marfino Sharashka, a scientific institute staffed with prisoners in its most privileged period. No one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire, and even then it is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, then growing numb and still. And then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, please forgive me. I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me, just as if she were moaning next to my ear. The citizen chief of the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next to us, from which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and to repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade, and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern, stood the punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her gray work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch on our territory. And another girl, slipping down into a ravine, had crawled her way to the Vladikino highway and escaped. The guard had bungled, and Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her, and they raised the alarm. A mean, dark major arrived and shouted that if they failed to catch the girl, the entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the woman brigadiers went into a rage, and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes. "Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch. I hope they take scissors and clip, 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 take off all her hair in front of the lineup." This wasn't something she had thought up herself. This was the way they punished women in the Gulag. But the girl, who was now standing outside the gatehouse in the cold, had sighed and said instead, "At least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us." The jailer overheard what she had said, and she was now being punished. Everyone else had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. This had been at 6 p.m., and now it was 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard stuck out his head and shouted, "Stand at attention, whore, or else it will be worse for you." And now she was not moving, only weeping. "Forgive me, Citizen Chief. Let me into the camp. I won't do it anymore." But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, "All right, idiot, come on in." The reason they were keeping her out there for so long was that the next day was Sunday, and she would not be needed for work. Such a straw, blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She'd been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. Fire. Fire. We fought the war, and we looked into the bonfires to see what kind of victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame in you, girl, I promise, the whole wide world will read about you. This is from John Milton from Paradise Lost. "For whence, but from the author of all ill, could spring so deep a malice to confound the race of mankind in one root, and earth with hell to mingle and involve, done all to spite the great Creator? I shall despair. There is no creature loves me, and if I die, no soul will pity me. Nay, wherefore should they, since that I myself find in myself no pity to myself?" That's Shakespeare. Solzhenitsyn describes the reactions and actions of staunch Communist Party members imprisoned and devoured by the system they supported and produced. Frequently, the camp system vacuumed people up really without any concern whatsoever for the niceties of individual guilt or innocence. As far as Stalin and his henchmen were concerned, there was probably something that you were guilty about at some point in your past, and there were no shortage of people to inform on you regardless of whether you had done anything. So one of the things that used to happen in the collective apartment buildings, of which there were nowhere near enough of, so multiple families would end up living in the same tiny apartment, was that if you could inform on someone down the hall who, you know, maybe refused to return the quarter cup of salt you had lent them or something like that, if you would inform on them and their family would be carted away to the concentration camp system, then you got to have their apartment. And so in East Germany at the height of the Soviet system, 1 out of every 3 people was a government informer. And so that meant if you had a family of 6 people, there were 2 people in every room that you were ever in who were ready to say to the authorities anything you ever had the temerity to speak, and perhaps to tell them all sorts of things that you didn't even do, because there was a requirement if you were an informer to ensure that you had something to say every time you came in to inform. Well, it didn't matter if you were a devout communist, because from time to time your door would be kicked down at 3 a.m. in the morning and people would come in with jackboots and get you dressed as rapidly as they possibly could and take you away when you were still half awake to the prison in the middle of the city and strip you of your clothes and give you things that didn't fit and shave your head and take you off to a camp, and you'd never get to see your family again. And that happened to millions of people. And it happened to staunch communists just like it happened to people who in principle were opposed to the system. And Solzhenitsyn thought that the staunch Communist Party members who were thrown into the camps had the worst time of it of everyone, because the people who'd already decided that the system was corrupt weren't really surprised when it happened, even though it was still terrible. But the Communist Party members had given their whole life to the system, and then they were picked up just like everyone else. And he had a very hard time with them when they came to prison, because most of them assumed that a terrible mistake had been made, and that if they just wrote the right people and contacted their former friends, who would now, by the way, have nothing to do with them, that the error would be rectified and they soon would be released. So they also assumed that everyone else in the camps was completely guilty and was there for good reason, because otherwise the beloved party wouldn't have put them there. But for some reason they had been imprisoned because they were innocent, despite the fact that they were innocent. And Solzhenitsyn and his friends used to play a game with people like that, because he didn't exactly know how to treat them, because on the one hand they were victims, certainly, but on the other hand they were part of the system that had perpetrated precisely the horrors that were visited on them. And so when they first came in and were still chock full of communist dogma and totalitarian thought and judgmental in every possible way, him and his friends would have fun pointing out all the shortages and catastrophes of the Soviet system, and then let them run through their algorithmic ideology and to the point of absurdity, and then really not spend much time communicating with them until they broke down and decided that things weren't so good for them or everybody else, and more or less entered the common run of humanity once again. To say that things were hard for them is to say almost nothing. They were incapable of assimilating such a blow, such a downfall, and from their own people too, from their own dear party, and from all appearances for nothing at all. After all, they'd been guilty of nothing as far as the party was concerned, nothing at all. It was painful for them to such a degree that it was considered taboo among them, uncomradely, to ask, "What were you imprisoned for?" The only squeamish generation of prisoners. The rest of us, with tongues hanging out, couldn't wait to tell the story to every chance newcomer we met, and to the whole cell, as if it were an anecdote. Here's the sort of people they were. Olga Sliosberg's husband had already been arrested, and they had come to carry out a search, and arrest her too. The search lasted 4 hours. And she spent those remaining 4 hours sorting out the minutes of the Congress of Stakhanovites of the bristle and brush industry, of which she had been secretary until the previous day. The incomplete state of the minutes troubled her more than her children, who she was now leaving forever. Even the interrogator conducting the search could not resist telling her, "Come on now, say farewell to your children." Here's the sort of people they were. A letter from her 15-year-old daughter came to Yelizaveta Tsetkova in the Kazan prison for long-term prisoners. Mama, tell me, write to me, are you guilty or not? I hope you weren't guilty, because then I won't join the Komsomol. So that was the Soviet youth organization. I won't join the Komsomol, and I won't forgive them because of you. But if you are guilty, I won't write you anymore, and I will hate you. And the mother was stricken by remorse in her damp, grave-like cell with its dim little lamp. How could her daughter live without the Komsomol? How could she be permitted to hate Soviet power? Better that she should hate me. And she wrote, I am guilty. Enter the Komsomol. How could it be anything but hard? It was more than the human heart could bear to fall beneath the beloved axe and then have to justify its wisdom. But that is the price a man pays for entrusting his God-given soul to human dogma. Even today, any Orthodox communist will affirm that Setkova acted correctly. Even today, they cannot be convinced that this is precisely the perversion of small forces, that the mother perverted her daughter and harmed her soul. Here's the sort of people they were. YT gave sincere testimony against her husband, anything to aid the party. Oh, how one could pity them, if at least now they had come to comprehend their former wretchedness. This whole chapter could have been written quite differently if today they had at least forsaken their earlier views. But it happened the way Maria Danielin had dreamed it would. If I leave here someday, I'm going to live as if nothing had taken place. Loyalty, in our view, it is just plain pig-headedness. These devotees to the theory of development construed loyalty to that development to mean renunciation of any personal development whatsoever. As Nikolai Adamovich Vilenchuk said after serving 17 years, we believed in the party and we were not mistaken. Is this loyalty or pig-headedness? It was not for show and not out of hypocrisy that they argued in the cells in defense of all the government's actions. They needed ideological arguments in order to hold onto a sense of their own rightness. Otherwise, insanity was not far off. I'm going to tell you a story. There's a story in Genesis. It's the last story in Genesis. It's called the Tower of Babel. It's a story, very short story. And it occurs after the story of Noah and the flood. The flood stories, by the way, are universally distributed except among desert dwellers who have no experience on which to hang the story. And Mircea Eliade, who wrote a great series of books called A History of Religious Ideas, documented the central narrative structure of flood stories. And so what happens is that there's a human settlement and it's washed away by a flood, and the flood is generally envisioned as a consequence of God's judgment. And so if you take the flood stories that are distributed worldwide and you boil them down to pull out their archetypal substructure, you find that there are fundamentally two reasons that a flood occurs. And Eliade says that it's the tendency of things to fall apart combined with the proclivity of human beings to sin. And so it means something. This means something. And so it means that everything is subject to entropic decay, right? Things fall apart of their own accord across time. That's why you have to always fix things. So if it's complicated, it has to be maintained. And so you can think about that in relationship to, say, New Orleans before the hurricane. Because people say, well, the hurricane caused a flood and that destroyed much of New Orleans. And so that's an act of God. That's one way of looking at it, right? It's a random natural event. But then you think, well, wait a minute. The Dutch, their country's mostly underwater, right? So they have these huge dikes to keep the sea back. And they build the dikes so that only one storm every 10,000 years will be of sufficient magnitude to partially breach the dikes. That's their engineering tolerance level. One storm in every 10,000 years. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers knew that the dikes in New Orleans were built to withstand one storm every 100 years, the biggest storm every 100 years. And people knew that they weren't built to proper tolerance, and much of the money that was hypothetically supposed to be diverted or assigned to the rebuilding and maintenance of the dikes disappeared because of corruption in New Orleans, which is in one of the most corrupt states in the United States. And so you might say, well, why did the flood destroy New Orleans? And one answer is, well, it was a hurricane, and the other answer is, no, it was corrupt officials who weren't paying attention to what they were supposed to be paying attention to. And the flood came, and that's the meaning of the stories, because of the sins of men, so to speak, which is the capacity of people to turn a blind eye to their responsibilities when they know perfectly well that something needs to be done. And so if you don't do what needs to be done and something comes along to wipe you out, then it's perfectly reasonable to view that as a judgment on your refusal to do what you knew to be right. So that's the flood story. And then the Tower of Babel is a very interesting story. It's very, very short. And what happens is that it just starts pretty much abruptly after the flood story ends. And it's a story about the decision that human beings take to build a mighty building, like a huge, huge edifice that would reach all the way up to the heavens to supplant God, roughly speaking. And so what happens is the building is built higher and higher and higher and higher, and God gets annoyed about this and divides everyone who's building the building into small groups who speak different languages, who then disperse, and the construction project comes to a halt. Now, it's a very strange story, but here's one way of thinking about it. The larger you build a system, the more there's a proclivity to worship it as if it's everything. That's the story of ideology, let's say. You want to build a comprehensive utopian system that supplants anything transcendent. You want to build it as large as possible so it encompasses everyone. Well, what happens as it grows? Well, it incorporates more and more people, but the people within it become more and more different from one another. And so essentially they start speaking different languages. And so the entire project of raising this massive edifice to supplant everything disperses into chaos and comes to a halt. Okay, so that's one story. So here's another story. This is a story that John Milton wrote. John Milton wrote Paradise Lost, which is one of the prime literary masterpieces of the last 500 years. Now, here's what Milton did. Milton said he was trying to justify the ways of God to man. That was his purpose. And so what he was trying to do was take a look at the world the way it's constituted, with all its suffering and malevolence and corruption, and to make a case why it was still acceptable. And so he did the first, what you might think about as psychoanalytic study of malevolence and evil. So around the corpus of biblical writings, there's an idea of heaven and hell, and they're not referred to much within the corpus of biblical writings, but there are what you might describe as legends that have compiled around them. So they're stories that never became canonical, and those are stories, for example, of the idea that God's highest angel, who was Satan, Lucifer, the bringer of light, the spirit of rationality, fomented a rebellion against God in heaven and was cast into hell as a consequence. And so there's this idea, Milton wrote this before the rise of the nation states, for example, and there's this idea that there's this tension between the political and ideological and rational constructions of the rational mind and the sort of transcendent mythology that guides human organization, and that Satan, as God's highest, as the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom, is a personification of the tendency of the rational mind to produce totalitarian systems and then to fall in love with them. So to produce a system that encompasses everything, like the Tower of Babel, so that nothing outside the system is allowed to exist. Well, Milton's intuition, because he collected the stories about satanic rebellion that had been accumulating across centuries from far before Christianity was even constituted, turned this into a great poetic drama. And his hypothesis was that the element of the psyche, let's say, the spiritual element of the psyche that characterized the rational mind, would, by its proclivity to produce these totalizing systems, end up casting itself into hell.